the fall of Rome and the birth of the Dark Ages. Before empires were remembered as ruins, and before history learned to whisper instead of proclaim, there was a world held together by roads, laws, and the belief that order could last forever. A world where Rome stood not only as a city, but as a promise of permanence. And when that promise began to fade, it did not vanish in a single moment, but dissolved slowly, quietly, leaving behind a silence that would shape centuries to come. This is not a story of sudden collapse or endless darkness, but of transformation, of a world learning how to breathe again after certainty was lost, of people who lived between the memory of greatness and the reality of survival. And in this first chapter, we return to the moment where the ancient world loosened its grip on time, where stone and empire gave way to earth and faith, and where the long, patient dawn of the Middle Ages began. Once, Rome stood at the center of the known world, not merely as a city of stone and marble, but as an idea of order, continuity, and unshakable permanence. Its roads stretched across continents, like veins carrying life. Its laws shaped the rhythm of daily existence, and its authority reached even the most distant provinces, where its banners fluttered in the wind as symbols of an empire that seemed eternal. Yet beneath this surface of stability, the foundations were slowly eroding, not with a sudden collapse, but with a quiet and persistent decay that went unnoticed by most who lived within its borders. Because great civilizations rarely fall with a single blow, and Rome was no exception. Its decline began not with fire and conquest, but with exhaustion, with the weight of its own vastness pressing down upon itself, stretching its resources thin, dulling its once sharp sense of purpose, and transforming governance into an endless struggle to maintain control over lands, too vast to be truly understood by those at the center. The emperors who once ruled with decisive authority became figures of instability, rising and falling in rapid succession, their reigns often defined by intrigue, betrayal, and fear rather than vision. While the Senate, once the beating heart of republican ideals, faded into a ceremonial shadow of its former self, unable to guide an empire that no longer knew where it was going. The army, long the backbone of Roman power, remained formidable in appearance, but fractured in loyalty, increasingly reliant on mercenaries whose allegiance was bound not to Rome itself, but to coin and survival. And as discipline weakened, so too did the invisible thread that held the empire together. At the borders, the pressure mounted steadily, as Germanic tribes and other migrating peoples moved closer, not always as invaders, but often as refugees pushed by forces beyond their control. Climate shifts, population pressures, and conflicts further east set entire peoples in motion, and Rome, once capable of absorbing and integrating newcomers, now viewed them with suspicion and fear, granting land in exchange for military service, unintentionally planting the seeds of fragmentation within its own territory. Cities that had thrived on trade and administrative importance began to wither as long-distance commerce declined. Roads fell into disrepair, aqueducts cracked and collapsed, and with each passing generation, fewer people remembered how to maintain the complex systems that had sustained urban life. Literacy, once widespread among administrators and merchants, became increasingly rare outside elite and religious circles. Knowledge that had been passed down through scrolls and schools slowly retreated into the quiet halls of monasteries, where monks copied ancient texts by candlelight, unaware that they were preserving the remnants of a fading world. For the ordinary people of the empire, daily life grew more uncertain. Taxes increased to support wars and defenses that seemed endless. Local officials wielded power arbitrarily, and the promise of Roman protection felt distant and unreliable. When the city of Rome itself was sacked in the early 5th century, the shock reverberated across the empire like a distant echo of thunder. Yet by then the idea of Rome as an invincible force had already begun to crumble in the collective mind. The sack was not the beginning of the end, but a confirmation of what many already sensed, that the age of certainty was over, that the structures which had defined their world were no longer capable of shielding them from chaos. As imperial authority weakened, people turned inward, seeking safety not in distant emperors, but in local strongmen, landowners, and emerging warlords who could offer immediate protection. This shift marked the slow transformation of Roman order into something new and unfamiliar, a patchwork of local powers bound by personal loyalty rather than universal law. The countryside became the center of survival, as cities emptied and rural estates evolved into self-sufficient units, laying the groundwork for what would later be known as feudalism. Though at the time it was simply a response to instability, a way to endure in a world where long-held assumptions no longer applied. The collapse of centralized authority did not mean the end of life or culture, but rather its reshaping into smaller, more fragile forms. Traditions blended as Roman customs mixed with those of incoming peoples, languages evolved, beliefs shifted, and Christianity, once a persecuted faith, emerged as a unifying force in a fractured world, offering meaning and continuity amid uncertainty. Bishops and abbots stepped into roles once filled by imperial administrators, providing leadership, education, and moral guidance. Yet even the church could not fully replace what had been lost. The sense of belonging to a vast and ordered whole faded into memory, replaced by a narrower horizon defined by village, land, and lord. Centuries later, historians would label this period the Dark Ages, not because life ceased or humanity regressed entirely, but because the clarity and abundance of written records diminished, leaving behind a time shrouded in partial silence and shadow. It was a world of dimly lit halls and earthen homes, of oral traditions and seasonal rhythms, where survival depended on cooperation and faith rather than imperial decree. The fall of Rome did not extinguish civilization, but transformed it, stripping away its monumental scale and revealing a more vulnerable human landscape, one where power was close at hand and danger even closer. And as the ancient world receded into legend, a new era quietly took shape, not with celebration or declaration, but with the slow turning of generations who no longer remembered Rome as a living presence, but only as a distant story told by elders, an echo of stone and glory fading into the mist of time. As generations passed, and the memory of Rome's living presence faded, what remained was not only ruin, but transformation, a slow reshaping of society that unfolded quietly across forests, fields, and scattered settlements. The great stone cities that once echoed with commerce and debate grew silent, their forums overtaken by weeds, their baths abandoned, their amphitheaters stripped of marble for nearby fortifications. People no longer gathered under the banner of empire, but around hearth fires, bound by kinship, necessity, and shared labor. The rhythms of life narrowed to the cycles of daylight and season, planting and harvest, birth and death, and within this smaller world, the idea of history itself changed, no longer written in chronicles of emperors and campaigns, but lived through memory and oral tradition, stories passed from one generation to the next, not to glorify conquest, but to teach survival. The land became the primary source of security. Ownership and control of soil meant protection, food, and influence. And those who could defend land naturally rose to positions of authority. Former Roman estates transformed into fortified manors, their owners becoming local lords whose power was measured not by law books, but by armed followers and the loyalty of those who depended on them. This shift was gradual and often unnoticed by those living through it, yet it marked one of the most profound changes in European history, the replacement of centralized imperial rule with decentralized local dominance. Rome's laws still lingered in fragments, adapted and reshaped to fit new realities. But justice became personal and uneven, varying from region to region, lord to lord, village to village. Security was no longer guaranteed by distant legions, but negotiated daily through service, obedience, and mutual dependence. The countryside filled with wooden homes and simple tools, iron became precious. Craftsmanship focused on necessity rather than elegance, and the art of survival overshadowed the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake. Yet even in this apparent decline, continuity persisted in unexpected ways. Monasteries emerged as islands of stability, their stone walls sheltering both faith and learning. Monks labored in silence, tending fields, caring for the sick, and copying ancient manuscripts, often without fully understanding the significance of the words they preserved. These quiet efforts ensured that the intellectual heritage of the ancient world was not entirely lost. Even as literacy vanished from much of society, the Church gradually assumed roles once held by Roman administrators, mediating disputes, organizing charity, and providing a shared moral framework that transcended local divisions. Christianity offered a sense of order and purpose in a fragmented world, its rituals marking time and its teachings promising meaning beyond hardship. For many, it became the only constant in lives shaped by uncertainty, invasions, and scarcity. Migrating peoples continued to move across former imperial lands, not always as enemies, but as settlers seeking stability, their customs blending with Roman traditions to form new cultures. Languages evolved as Latin, fractured into regional dialects, the foundations of modern European tongues slowly taking shape. Identity shifted from Roman citizenship to tribal affiliation and local allegiance. The idea of belonging changed, no longer tied to an empire, but to a place, a lord, a faith. The collapse of Rome did not result in immediate darkness, but in a dimming, a lowering of light where fewer records were kept and fewer voices were heard beyond local boundaries. Later scholars would look back and see gaps in knowledge, interpreting silence as absence. Yet life continued with resilience and quiet adaptation. Families endured, communities formed, and humanity adjusted to a world without imperial certainty. Violence was present but not constant, hardship common but not universal. And even in the harshest conditions, moments of peace and continuity existed. The so-called Dark Ages were not a uniform experience, but a mosaic of realities shaped by geography, climate, and human choice. In some regions, Roman structures persisted longer. In others, they vanished quickly, leaving behind only faint traces beneath the soil. What united these centuries was not ignorance, but transition, a prolonged passage from one world to another. A time when the old order had died, But the new had not yet fully emerged. People lived between memory and invention, drawing upon fragments of the past while improvising paths forward. And as the centuries advanced, this improvisation slowly solidified into new systems. Feudal bonds became more formalized. Castles rose where open estates once stood. Knights replaced legionaries, and the language of loyalty replaced that of citizenship. Yet beneath these changes, the shadow of Rome remained, its ruins looming over fields, its roads guiding travelers, long after imperial authority had vanished. A silent reminder of what had been lost, and what had shaped the present. The fall of Rome was not merely an end, but a transformation that reshaped the human landscape, compressing vast structures into smaller forms, turning universal rule into local power, written law into custom, and imperial ambition into survival. And from this transformation, the Middle Ages were born, not with a single moment or declaration, but with the slow, almost imperceptible turning of centuries, as people adapted to a quieter, narrower world where the future was uncertain and the past lingered like a half-remembered dream. And in this world of shadows and emerging light, the foundations were laid for everything that would follow. The kingdoms, conflicts, beliefs, and cultures that would define Europe for 1,000 years, all rooted in the long, patient aftermath of Rome's fall. As the centuries moved forward, and the immediate shock of imperial collapse settled into a distant memory, the people living upon the former lands of Rome no longer measured time by the reigns of emperors or the expansion of borders, but by harvests survived and winters endured. The concept of progress itself softened, becoming less about advancement and more about continuity, about holding together what little stability could be found in an unpredictable world. The disappearance of centralized authority reshaped human relationships at their core. Loyalty became personal rather than abstract, a matter of face-to-face bonds rather than distant allegiance. And this personal nature of power defined daily existence. Protection was exchanged for labor, land was worked in return for shelter, and survival depended upon one's place within a tightly bound hierarchy that was as much social as it was economic. Fear of invasion lingered like a low fog across the countryside. Memories of raids and violence passed down through generations, shaping defensive instincts that favored isolation and caution. Villages clustered around churches or fortifications. Paths through forests were avoided after dark, and the world beyond familiar borders felt vast and threatening. Yet even within this narrowed horizon, humanity adapted with remarkable resilience. Tools were refined, farming methods slowly improved, and communal practices emerged to share burdens and risks. Festivals marked the turning of seasons, offering brief moments of joy and relief amid hardship, and oral storytelling flourished as the primary means of preserving identity and meaning. Tales of heroes, saints, and ancient rulers blended history and myth into narratives that provided both instruction and comfort. The Roman past transformed into legend, its emperors remembered not as administrators, but as near mythical figures whose deeds seemed larger than life. This mythologizing of Rome softened the pain of loss, turning collapse into story and story into heritage. While the physical remnants of the empire continued to shape the land in subtle ways, broken roads still guided travel, ruined walls provided stone for new buildings, and ancient boundaries influenced emerging political divisions long after their original purpose had been forgotten. The Church's influence deepened during this time. Not through force, but through presence, monasteries became centers of stability, where knowledge, agriculture, and care converged. Their routines offered a rhythm that contrasted with the uncertainty outside their walls. Prayer structured time, labor grounded it, and within these enclaves a fragile thread of learning survived. Manuscripts copied not out of ambition, but devotion, preserving fragments of philosophy, science, and history that might otherwise have vanished entirely. Yet even these texts were often filtered through a new worldview, interpreted in light of faith rather than reason alone, reflecting a shift in how humanity understood its place in the universe. The cosmos, once explained through rational order, now framed as divine design. This change did not erase curiosity, but redirected it inward, toward moral meaning and spiritual purpose. While political power remained fragmented, new identities slowly emerged. Kingdoms formed from the blending of Roman populations and migrating peoples, their rulers claiming legitimacy through conquest, tradition, or divine favor. Borders remained fluid, authority contested, and warfare frequent but localized. The absence of a unifying empire meant conflicts rarely escalated into continent-wide struggles, instead shaping a patchwork of rivalries and alliances that ebbed and flowed with generations. Technology advanced unevenly. Some skills were lost while others adapted to new needs. Heavy armor and fortified structures replaced the mobility of Roman legions, signaling a shift toward defense rather than expansion. Yet even in this defensive posture, seeds of future change were being planted. The emphasis on land ownership laid foundations for economic systems that would later evolve. The Church's organizational structure hinted at centralized authority that could one day rival secular power, and the preservation of texts ensured that ancient knowledge could be rediscovered when conditions allowed. The so-called darkness of the age was not an absence of light, but a period of low illumination, where sparks were fewer but not extinguished. Human creativity did not disappear, but narrowed its focus, channeling itself into survival, faith, and community. The memory of Rome lingered as both warning and aspiration, a reminder of grandeur lost and a template for order imagined. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Europe began to change again. Populations stabilized, trade cautiously resumed along familiar routes, towns re-emerged at crossroads and rivers, and with them a renewed exchange of ideas. This gradual reawakening would eventually lead to the medieval renaissance of learning and culture. But for those living in the early centuries after Rome's fall, the future remained unseen, their lives shaped not by visions of progress, but by the steady effort to endure, to protect what little they had, and to pass it on to those who came after. And in this quiet persistence lay the true legacy of the age, a testament to humanity's ability to adapt when certainty collapses, to rebuild meaning from fragments, and to carry forward the unseen foundations upon which later civilizations would rise. The fall of Rome thus became not merely a historical event, but a long transformation that reshaped the human experience itself, guiding the world from the classical past into the medieval future through centuries of patience, hardship, and unspoken resilience. As memory stretched further away from the age of emperors and marble cities, the sense of living in the aftermath of something immense became less conscious and more instinctive. People no longer spoke of Rome as a recent loss, but as a distant origin. a foundation buried beneath layers of time, shaping the land without defining daily thought. Children grew up without ever seeing a paved road or a standing aqueduct. For them, the world had always been fields bordered by forest, small churches rising from stone and wood, and the looming presence of a lord's hall or fortress on the horizon. Authority was something visible and tangible rather than abstract. It rode on horseback. It collected grain. It offered protection or punishment. And this immediacy of power altered how people understood obedience and trust. The concept of citizenship faded entirely, replaced by belonging defined through obligation, service, and proximity. The idea that one might appeal to a distant ruler for justice seemed almost fantastical. Disputes were settled locally, often through custom rather than written law, and memory carried as much weight as decree. Elders remembered how things had been done, and that memory shaped what was considered right. In this way, tradition replaced legislation, forming a living code that varied from valley to valley, river to river. The landscape itself became a historical record, each field boundary, path, and ruin telling a story to those who knew how to read it. Roman stones embedded in medieval walls, inscriptions worn smooth by time, foundations of villas transformed into barns or chapels. The past was not studied but inhabited, walked upon, and reused, and yet its meaning slowly shifted, stripped of imperial context, and reinterpreted through local need and belief. The Church continued to weave together fragments of a shared world view, its calendar organizing time through holy days and fasts, its rituals offering reassurance in moments of fear, disease, and loss. When plague or famine struck, prayer became both explanation and response. A means of understanding suffering and seeking relief, faith filled the gaps left by vanished institutions, offering narratives where history no longer could. And this reliance on the spiritual shaped culture profoundly. Art became symbolic rather than realistic, focused on conveying meaning rather than likeness. Music echoed through simple chants, repetitive and meditative, mirroring the rhythms of labor and devotion. Education remained rare, but where it existed, it was deeply tied to religious purpose. Learning was not pursued for mastery of the world, but for mastery of the soul. Yet even within this inward focus, seeds of intellectual continuity endured. Monks debated theology, preserved logic, and quietly engaged with questions inherited from antiquity, ensuring that reason did not vanish but slept, awaiting more favorable conditions to awaken. Meanwhile, the political landscape remained fluid and unstable. Kingdoms rose and fell within generations, their boundaries shaped by war, marriage, and inheritance. Rather than ideology, loyalty was often tested, alliances fragile, and violence an ever-present possibility. Yet this instability did not equate to constant chaos. Most lives were marked more by routine than conflict, by long days of labor and nights of rest, punctuated occasionally by fear or celebration. The absence of imperial ambition meant that wars were smaller in scale, devastating locally but limited in reach, and this limitation allowed life to continue elsewhere, largely unchanged, creating a patchwork of experiences rather than a single narrative. Historians looking back would struggle to impose coherence upon this complexity, labeling centuries as dark because they resisted simple explanation. Yet within this resistance lay authenticity, the lived reality of countless individuals whose names were never recorded, but whose actions shaped the course of history through endurance, rather than conquest. Women maintained households and fields, passing down knowledge essential to survival. Children learned skills through imitation rather than instruction. Communities adapted customs to changing circumstances, blending old practices with new realities. And over time, these adaptations hardened into traditions that defined emerging medieval culture. The slow re-emergence of trade brought subtle changes. Merchants traveled cautiously, carrying goods and stories between regions, reintroducing a sense of connection beyond the local. Markets formed at crossroads. Towns began to grow again, not as imperial centers but as hubs of exchange and craft. These developments hinted at a future beyond subsistence, a gradual widening of horizons that would, centuries later, transform Europe once more. But during the early Middle Ages, this future remained distant, fragile, easily disrupted, and so life continued within narrow bounds, shaped by land, faith, and memory. The fall of Rome remained its silent starting point, not as an event continually recalled, but as a condition inherited, a world where certainty had been lost and replaced by resilience, where greatness was remembered but not pursued, and where survival itself became a quiet form of wisdom, passed from one generation to the next like an unspoken lesson. Teaching humanity how to live without the structures it once believed essential, and in doing so, laying the groundwork for new forms of order yet to come. As the long shadow of Rome continued to stretch across centuries that no longer remembered its voice, the world that had emerged from its fall settled into a fragile balance, neither wholly broken nor fully reborn, a quiet equilibrium shaped by necessity rather than ambition. And in this balance, humanity learned to live with less certainty and fewer guarantees, to find meaning not in grand structures, but in continuity. In the simple fact of endurance, the fields were still sown each spring, the forests still yielded wood and shelter. Children were still born into a world that felt complete to them, even if it seemed diminished to those who remembered stories of marble cities and endless roads. And in this way, history revealed one of its most subtle truths, that no age perceives itself as an ending, only as a present shaped by what came before. The people of the early Middle Ages did not wake each day believing they lived in darkness. They woke to work, to prayer, to family, to weather and soil, and within these routines life retained its fullness, sorrow and joy woven together as they always had been. The label of darkness would come much later, applied by those who looked backward from a future rebuilt upon foundations laid quietly during these centuries, foundations formed not by conquest or decree, but by adaptation, patience, and memory. The collapse of Rome had removed the illusion of permanence, teaching humanity that even the greatest systems could dissolve. Yet it had also revealed something enduring beneath stone and law, the capacity of people to reorganize, to create new bonds when old ones failed, to preserve fragments of knowledge without fully understanding their eventual importance, and to carry forward values through custom and belief rather than institution. In this sense, the so-called Dark Ages were not an absence, but a threshold, a long crossing between worlds, where humanity learned again how to live at a smaller scale, how to anchor meaning locally when universality disappeared, and how to trust in slow growth rather than immediate certainty. As centuries passed, these lessons would bear fruit, towns would expand, learning would reawaken, trade would knit distant regions together once more, and Europe would slowly step into a new phase of its history, carrying within it both the scars and the wisdom of Rome's fall. But at this moment, in the quiet aftermath, the world rested in transition, neither ancient nor fully medieval, suspended in a long twilight, where echoes of empire mingled with the first murmurs of something new. And it is here, in this space between collapse and renewal, that the true beginning of the Middle Ages can be found, not marked by a single date or event, but by a gradual acceptance of uncertainty and a collective turning inward, a recalibration of human life. Around land, faith, and community, Rome had fallen, but humanity had not. It had simply changed its pace, trading speed for patience, scale for intimacy, and ambition for survival. And in doing so, it laid the unseen groundwork for all that would follow. The castles and kingdoms, the cathedrals and crusades, the struggles and transformations yet to come, all born from this long, quiet reckoning with impermanence. And as the memory of Rome finally settled into history rather than loss, the world moved forward not with the certainty of empire, but with the resilience of those who had learned to endure without it, closing one chapter of human civilization, not with silence, but with a steady, persistent breath that carried history onward into the medieval age.